Thanks very much, Ali. And I think as many you will know in the room, that ACSI sees a just transition as really critical to our broader net zero ambitions for both the companies and the funds represented today. It's been a feature of our work, both in company engagement, industry level of engagement, as well as discussions with policymakers, including the current conversation about creating a just transition authority in Australia. Now, as Australia tackles these issues, and we've already heard about this from the Minister this morning, there's a lot we can actually learn from the international experience. So before we dive into questions in the room, I was lucky enough to sit down and have an interview with a global authority on this issue, Professor Jim Skier, who sits on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, but he's also chair of the Scottish Just Transition Authority. So we'll hear from Jim now, and we'll continue the conversation in the room after the short video.
Professor Jim Skier, welcome to the ACSI conference, and it's fantastic to have you join us.
Great to be here, Ed.
As we tackle the challenges of the energy transition in Australia, we can learn a lot from other countries that are further progressed and are tackling similar challenges. So can you give us a background to Scotland's energy transition and government response?
So the background to it, again, about 6 or 7 years ago, the Scottish Trades Union Congress and Friends of the Earth Scotland got together and they formed something called a Just Transition Partnership, which was these two bodies working together. And, there are obvious, there can be tensions between the environmental movement and the trade union movement, but they recognised they had, I don't know, maybe an 80% overlap of interests. So they wanted to work on these. So this Just Transition Partnership got working, and they recommended to the Scottish Government that they create a Just Transition Commission, which was established in late 2018, which had was independent of government, but all the members of the commission were appointed. So that's kind of the background as to where we've got to on Just Transition. Worthwhile saying that the Just Transition Commission, which I'm chairing, has taken a hard look about just how wide the concept of just transition might be applied. So obviously the core of it is rundown, changes in patterns of energy supply, implications for workers and communities. But we have decided to take a wider perspective on it to reflect the particular Scottish context. So we're also looking at energy demand, and we've also extended it to other sectors, notably agriculture and land use, which is an incredibly difficult issue in Scotland for all issues related to land tenure. And many just transition principles really apply to in that sector as well.
That's really useful, because I think it still is seen in that narrow lens in Australia, and we haven't yet talked to the demand issue. I'm interested, alongside the Commission, the other elements of government decision making and the establishment of a ministry. I'd be interested in that background.
Yeah, well, when the Just Transition Commission has gone through 2 phases, and we reported, the first phase reported about 2 years ago, just before the parliamentary elections in Scotland. And one of the recommendations was that there should be somebody, we actually recommended somebody at cabinet level with a responsibility for just transition. The government responded, it actually accepted all our phase 1 recommendations in whole without any modification. We're still checking whether they're being implemented or not. And they came back with the proposition that there should be an energy minister for just transition, with whom we've been interacting for a couple of years. As you might be aware, there's been a change of First Minister in Scotland in the last few weeks. And the new First Minister, Humza Yousaf, has actually created a cabinet level position for net zero and just transition. So our original recommendation has now been completely fulfilled. We do have that responsibility at the cabinet level, and we're just looking forward to how we're going to make that arrangement work. The Just Transition Commission and the Scottish Government have established a memorandum of understanding for the ways that we interact, the way that information is exchanged, the way that we see draft just transition plans as they're coming through to help help with their development. So it's still work in progress to look out the arrangement, but we do have a cabinet level responsibility now, which I think is good news.
That's so interesting to hear, Jim. And perhaps to go back again to the early piece of the story, in Australia, we still have the naysayers who say, why is the focus put on this question of just transition? I'm just interested in how you describe the opportunity or the why the just transition is so critical in the context of a broader energy transition.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, it's got to be seen in the context of net zero ambition, and let's not kid ourselves. That is a really difficult ambition to have. The Scottish Climate Change Act says that Scotland should reach net zero emissions by 2045, 5 years before the rest of the UK. And the way when we were set up in a way is not to question that target and that level of ambition. We were there to address the how question. How do you make that transition fair? How do you make sure that you take advantage of the opportunities? And how do you make sure that particular groups of workers, particular communities, particular classes of consumers are not disadvantaged unduly? So to pay attention to the costs and benefits. And I think if you accept the net zero principle, then the fact that you do this with a sense of justice and fairness is probably one I think that people buy into. If there's controversy, perhaps it might be about the net zero itself, but that is outside our remit.
No, that's really useful, Jim. And the point you just made there really rang true with our experience. Often we think of just transition simply in terms of risk. You've also mentioned the opportunity. How do you see those opportunities in the Scottish context?
Yeah, well, for the energy sector, it's pretty much. I mean, Scotland as a country has been blessed with energy. Back the 19th century, we had coal, we had an oil and gas boom starting in the 1970s. And Scotland also has just huge opportunities in terms of renewable energy, particularly wind, both onshore and offshore. And some of the offshore developments off the shores of Scotland are extraordinarily big. The gigawatt size offshore wind farms, the wind turbines as tall as skyscrapers. It's truly impressive stuff. And I think the challenge is to make sure that there are opportunities for those who are currently working in the energy supply sector to transition into the new kinds of jobs that will start to develop as we make that transition. So you can already see that a lot of the offshore skills from the oil and gas sector can be transferred over to offshore wind. There's a lot of commonality around perhaps more the civil engineering aspects of it. We're also very interested in the downstream skills in the oil and gas industry that might be moved into areas like hydrogen production or carbon capture and storage. And also, the geologists within the oil and gas companies also have a role to play in sort of, exploring for and exploiting the ability to store carbon in unused oil and gas, in depleted oil and gas fields under the North Sea. So the opportunities are there. I think the challenges, that our union colleagues constantly remind of us is to make sure that the jobs are high quality jobs, which is kind of a code for well-paid jobs. And we also have, challenges to make sure that people are re-skilled so that they can actually participate in the lower zero carbon economy, based on the underlying skills and competences that they have already developed.
That's so useful, Jim. And in Australia, the establishment of a Just Transition Authority is actually something that's currently under discussion. So I'd be interested in your views about that process, and also any lessons you have or ideas you have that we can plagiarise from the Scottish experience.
Yeah, plagiarism, you borrow as much as you want. That's certainly not an issue. Just to say, I think the word authority carries slightly different connotations from commission. It implies kind of decisive powers. And just to emphasise, our commission is advisory, and also we have a scrutiny role in our second phase, under the remit we've been given by the Scottish Government. But I think the key thing is to make sure that the body is made up of individuals that reflect all of the key interests that are going to be involved in the transition. And it's also important, so I'm talking about unions, environmental groups, community groups, business. I mean, that reflects the kind of range we have on our Just Transition Commission. And I think the other important thing, it's really important to keep dialogue with all the people who will be affected by the transition as it takes place. So one thing that we have done is for every meeting of the Commission, we don't sit in windowless offices in Edinburgh and Glasgow all the time, though I'm afraid we have to suffer that occasionally. We get out and around Scotland. We went out to the Isle of Lewis, for example, which is in the remote northwest, to look at peatland restoration, community energy projects. We've been to Aberdeen in the northeast to talk with oil and gas workers. And that experience of talking to people more in town hall kind of meeting formats has been really, really useful to give us a broader understanding of what's going on. And I may say also, when you go on these visits, the fact that we may go and have a meal together in the evening before the meeting and go to the pub afterwards has actually created some of the chemistry that you need to make people from different sectors work together and build up a shared trust among the members of the Commission.
And I know we could discuss these issues for hours, but unfortunately we're near to the end of time. But I guess as an audience of global investors, what challenge would you leave us with?
Yeah, I mean, this is very much in the context of the fairly broad concept we've taken of just transition. But just to say, I mean, again, the challenges of large-scale renewables are not to be underestimated. But in a way, I find that to be the easiest part from the investment community, especially from people in pension funds, which I know that this conference refers to, where there are really solid investments in renewable energy that will generate long-term returns if the energy markets are designed the right way. And these are big decisions. You can package it up in the tens and hundreds of millions, even billions, to get these projects going, which means you can get your teeth into them. A lot of the future challenges are going to come for investments that are much smaller scale. It's about homeowners retrofitting their houses. It's about farmers modifying their agricultural practices, which may have implications for machinery. But these are the kind of decisions that investments that you measure in the thousands or the tens of thousands. And it's the question of how you can aggregate and package these kinds of projects to make them attractive to investors and find mechanisms and modalities for making these things happen, I think is going to be the big challenge for the future, because renewable energy is the first box we need to tick on the way to net zero. There are a lot of sectors that are very difficult, and how you make the money flow to these sectors where individual projects may be much smaller, I think is going to be one of the biggest challenges.
No, thanks, Jim. And I think our audience is up to take on that challenge. We really appreciate your work, the work of not only of the Commission, but also the contribution of the IPCC, which you're a part of. So with that, thank you again, and let's come back to our panel in the room to continue this discussion.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thanks everyone, and funny to throw to yourself in the room, but also a little bit dangerous. A nice Scottish accent this late in the afternoon relaxes it all a little bit. So let's get back in the room and energised and really earn our afternoon tea now. Looking at these things through an Australian lens, I'm really mindful that we often talk about just transition as something that's 10 or 20 years in the future, or this sort of fuzzy concepts. But I think, Travis, for your work, the reality at AGL is really in the here and now. I'd be interested just to talk about what it means for you, in your job as it stands?
Look, as you say, it absolutely is the here and now for AGL, but it also has that future element. So I'd like to touch on both of those today. AGL, of course, operates a series of plants that are located in the regions and have been involved in providing economic prosperity to those regions over many decades. And we have set out a closure path for every one of those assets. Most notably, perhaps, given recent press, the Liddell closure last week, which I think was a huge success from the respectful nature in which that closure is undertaken. And I think the coverage of it picked up on that. But there's a great example of where the transition is occurring right now before our eyes. I guess if there's one message I'd like to give about transmission today, it's that each transition happens in its own unique set of circumstances. With respect to Liddell, we were fortunate enough to have a facility just across the road, the Bayswater Power Station, and that could accommodate a large proportion of the workforce transferring across that. We had no forced redundancies as part of it. There were some retirements, but the workforce was able to be transitioned over to the Bayswater Power Station. That's a very fortunate and, dare I say it, unique set of circumstances when you're looking at what might happen into the future. So it's excellent, and we're very proud of what we're able to achieve there. But to be frank, it's not necessarily going to be the case for all, or perhaps many, where you can have the same industry in the same location, the same skill set, and indeed in this circumstance, the same organisation. Just a couple other examples. When Hazelwood closed down in Victoria, in the Latrobe Valley, that wasn't an AGL facility, but we were able to transfer 50 employees from that facility over to our Loy Yang facility. And then similarly, if you look over at Torrens Island in South Australia, the closure for that plant is 3 years away, noted for 2026, and the individual conversations with employees at Torrens about potential future paths and the support we can help provide them with that starts formally this month, an individual conversation with each one. So it is absolutely a here and now discussion for us. At the same time, and what's much more closer to my role at AGL, is there is very much a forward-looking opportunity lens to this, which I think was picked up also in the video that just played. That is, of course, about the significant investment in renewables that's happening all across the industry, and certainly by AGL as well. And then with decarbonisation generally, so not renewable energy specifically, but decarbonisation generally, and the new industries, the new types of industries that come as part of that. One example is hydrogen, but there's decarbonisation of existing industries is also part of that. And we need the investment and development of those industries to create the jobs of the future, because clear as day, the number of roles and employment opportunities required by a coal-fired power station are very different to a gas-fired power station and very different to other renewables and batteries. So you need other investment in other industries, and I think the challenge identified there is a very real one.
That's useful, Travis. To go back to your first point on Liddell and the fact that Bayswater is still there, there's other projects popping up next door. The challenge being that Bayswater has its own clock and wind down. Do you worry about the fact that there won't be another Bayswater at the other end of that process, or it will be a harder transition?
Yeah, we're incredibly conscious of that. You've got a bigger run-up, and as I say, ideally the future roles in that region, they don't have to be in that region, but I think a lot of the transition is about regions and communities and prosperity in those communities. That is something we're incredibly conscious of, and so therefore the work starts now around the transition. Of course, one of the advantages is that with the closure of Liddell, the formal handover of that actually takes place Monday next week to our transition team, which is the team that will then level the land. And we're already talking about new developments there, such as the battery that we've got planning approval for, haven't reached FID on yet. But there's the example of the new industries that will actually be located on the land where the Liddell power station was. So this is part of the investment that needs to take place to create these new opportunities. But your point's well made. It will be a much more difficult process.
No, that's really useful. Again, reminder everyone to get on the app because, again, I have a long list of questions. I'll easily fill the time, but I really want to bring in the audience. But Travis, I wanted to throw to you here. Sorry, Warwick, I wanted to throw to you here. We often talk about the just transition, again, high level, theoretical, or a conversation that, for the future, but that's not what the experience for the workers and the communities in the Hunter Valley where you're based and the people you're working with. So, what's that context like?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting time at the moment. I think we've started to get to a point where there's a more straightforward, more honest conversation. I think exactly the type of things Travis is talking about, where we've progressed from the point where it had to be always this big positive story about how the transition to renewables was going to be a good thing, whereas in reality, not everyone is going to get a lolly bag to go home with at the end of the day. I think the way Jim was talking about it was really accurate. And in a region like the Hunter, just to sort of paint a bit of a picture about what the place is like. So we've got about 14,000 coal miners in the region, which are largely concentrated in a couple of regional towns. So talking about places like Muswellbrook and Singleton, where you've got every second person literally is working in the coal industry, and those places have had long-term prosperity built on these industries, but also, particularly over the last 20 years with the thermal coal export boom, a really high level of prosperity that's now been there for essentially a couple of generations of workers. And so there's a very strong bullshit detector in those communities. And as a region, we've been having what in actual fact is probably a 20-year-long conversation about the transition. So our last big structural shock was when our steelworks closed in Newcastle just over 20 years ago now, and there was a big promise of green jobs straight after that, and we haven't seen too many of them since. And so it's created this situation where there's a level of scepticism about the sort of theoretical conversation about just transition. But what's really interesting that's happened over the last couple of years is that it started to become a conversation about, okay, this is a real thing that's happening. We're seeing coal-fired power stations closing. Yes, we can debate the sort of pace of change around what might happen with our thermal export industry, which is where most of the jobs are. But the trajectory is quite clear. And so it's become less about, greenies in wine bars doing things to the region and become more about, okay, this is actually something that is happening in the outside world. And I wouldn't want to paint a picture that, we're all on board regionally with, this idea of a capital J, capital T just transition. Like, there's still a lot of different opinions in there. But what's happening is that people have gone, okay, right, this is a real thing, and how do we get to grips with it? The difficulty has been, I think, we've chewed up a hell of a lot of that lead time with this sort of politicised, weaponised conversation, and that's actually the easy bit, getting to the landing point of going, all right, this is a real thing. The hard bit, as I think AGL experienced and others have, is what do you actually do about it? And to break it down, I think this will maybe help illuminate some of the rest of the conversation, but the way we think about it, and I guess, to steal the phrase, it's sort of just transition with Hunter Valley characteristics, maybe. We tend to think of ourselves as a bit of a sort of republic of the Hunter Valley, but what it seems to look like is there's the actual energy transition, so they're keeping the lights on, dealing with the trilemma. Obviously that's the ballpark that AGLs and others are in. The two bits that we tend to focus on is actually more of a focus in the long run for the region. The second one is procedural justice. So that is workers and communities feeling supported and knowing that someone is in their corner. There's a great researcher from the University of South Australia that describes it as everything that could have been done was done, and that is critical. And it's actually the easy bit, but we don't do it well in Australia. The second bit or the third bit, sorry, is much harder, and it's how do you fill a hole in a regional economy, particularly a very large one like the Hunter, where you've got thousands and thousands of people that are dependent on these industries, and there's no easy answers for that. But there's a bunch of things we can learn from elsewhere and from our own experience.
No, thanks, Warwick, and there's a lot we can unpack there. Just want to come back to you, the Minister this morning talked about that weaponised conversation or moving the government approach, and he used the term, or the government's commitment to sort of talk to his own electorate and say, we've got your back. Is that how people are feeling? Are they hearing that message? Again, in the ESG world, we have to verify everything we hear from companies and others, so bit of verification.
Look, to be honest, I would say there's a couple of dynamics at play there, right? So the organisation that I was with previously, the 100 Jobs Alliance, was like a localised version of what Jim was talking about with Friends of the Earth and the union movement in Scotland. And essentially we were set up in order to try and stretch that Overton window, that ability to talk about these issues. And to the credit of government actors, both state and federally, they've gone through that window and are starting to get to grips with it. But you know, is the general population of the Hunter, you know, feeling like either level of government has their back? Not yet, I would say. You know, there's a part of the reality that there's just, you know, 700,000 people going about their daily life and work who aren't necessarily waking up thinking about the just transition every morning. So that's always going to be a reality, but it's not visible on the ground yet. And we have chewed up a lot of time, and we're starting to get stung a bit having a theoretical conversation, whereas what people want to see is tangibles that they can see and feel in the community on the ground that makes them know that somebody is having a go at being in charge of this.
No, definitely. And Ros, I really want to bring you in here. You know, we've heard the company and community perspective, but how's the just transition becoming an issue for investors and particularly for you at CBUS?
Thanks, Ed, and good afternoon, everyone. Like many of the investors in the room and corporates for that matter, I mean, ultimately what we want to ensure is, you know, an orderly transition so that, you know, our members' benefits or our shareholders' benefits are protected. So if done well, of course, you know, an orderly transition, if it's achieved, you know, will create and result in an equitable transition, you know, opportunities for workers, communities, including First Peoples. And it should also lead to job creation, nation building, which is great for our economy and great for our members. So I did also want to say that, you know, of course, if it's not managed well, then, you know, there will be consequences felt disproportionately by some pockets of the community, as Warwick has just spoken to. And adding to what Vicky said on the last panel, our membership, we've got members in allied industries. So if this is not managed well, they're going to be impacted. So our members directly will be impacted. So what can we do as investors? And I think like any ESG issue, we can educate ourselves, we can inform ourselves, we can discuss, you know, and educate ourselves along with you know, relevant stakeholders. We can partner with groups like ACSI, the Australian Energy Transition Initiative, ASFI, IGCC. I know it's a long list. There is a lot of organisations out there that we can support and be efficient in terms of developing research, identifying pathways, those sorts of things. And we can engage. We can engage with companies like AGL and others to, I guess, encourage earlier and better planning for affected you know, workers and communities and those sorts of things. We can advocate, and there's a lot more advocacy going on now with this change of government for improved policy settings, coordination and planning. And I think we need to be willing to support, I guess, the development of new investment opportunities and ultimately to allocate capital to those opportunities.
That's really useful, Ros. And we've actually just had a question on the app to sort of follow that through. You know, does the focus on the sort of weighted average carbon intensity inhibit the just transition by incentivising either companies or investors just to get rid of high-emitting assets or push them into private hands?
Fabulous question. What I'd say is, at CBUS, we don't just rely on measuring weighted average cost of capital. We're looking at extending our ability to measure, how our portfolio is transitioning, how the companies within that are transitioning. So what I would say is, we're actually looking to measure more appropriately. And so I don't think that particular measurement method limits our ability to actively manage this particular risk.
But do you feel that pressure on because again, to the divestment investment piece, does that come up in the Just Transition conversation?
Look, I think we're under a lot of pressure, whether it's investors or companies, to either divest immediately or sell off assets. But that really misses the point, and it really pushes the issue to others. It means that, immediately workers and communities are unprotected at that point. And I think, I've just lost my train of thought there, but really, I think it then, increases energy security risks. So there's any number of things that happen if we go down the divestment path. And it's so simple and it sounds easy, but as I say, it does make it somebody else's problem. Energy security risks and the workers and communities are not protected. And so I think we need to think about that really holistically.
Absolutely. And I guess, Travis, for the company perspective, that sort of pressure to divest or spin out assets or push them private, do you feel that within AGL?
We've got our own particular story over the past couple of years, which I won't go into, but look, I think this is becoming a more nuanced conversation. So it starts off with a rather black and white view around renewables versus carbon emitting or high carbon emitting, and then you get into these other themes which are around what is the nature of the orderly transition? How do you keep up security supply? How do you transition workforces? How do you keep open to new technologies? I mean, it's astonishing to think that lithium-ion batteries, just to do a little bit of tech here for a second, but it's astonishing to think that grid-scale lithium-ion batteries are now considered normal in the grid, whereas 10 years ago, they were revolutionary. And so there's a whole range of other themes that need to be woven into this around technology and so my comment then around the divestment side was that there's also becoming more nuanced about that. I'm sure there's elements where it's appropriate, but the reality is I think the globe has a series of objectives we're trying to meet. You can play that out into different economies and different organisations. The panel before us spoke about the need for a carbon transition story. Organisations like AGL clearly are at the forefront of that because we have to be. That's the business we're in. Hence, we've laid out our closure plan. And so I think then it becomes about the way that story is playing out. And then underneath that, you have the consequences of that decision of where just transition plays into around the impacts on the community, the workforce, and indeed consumers, which I thought was a really interesting angle brought out by the videos. So I think it's more nuanced. It's going to keep heading in that direction, particularly as we head into decarbonisation of the economy. Because then it moves from just quite simply, this is about carbon emitting power generation to renewables, and then you start talking about other sectors of the economy that don't necessarily use solely electricity, and that then makes it a much more nuanced, much more multi-headed serpent that we're trying to tame. And in that sense, you can't do a black and white version of it. It requires a whole of economy response.
Absolutely. And now, most popular question on the iPad as it stands is for you, Warwick, about the super funds in the audience today are investing in the big fossil fuel employers in the Hunter. How can we help to bring about the just transition for Hunter workers and communities?
Yeah, look, so I think there's probably three things that come to mind, and I'm taking on board, I think that nuanced conversation is happening. I think it is important to keep divestment in the kit bag as an important tool. We are talking about a big change, and so there's always going to be an element of keeping companies honest, and so I'd say off the bat that's important, but more directly to the local circumstances. If you look at the the kind of framework that we use, you're talking about, on one hand, procedural justice, so supporting the humans through the change, and on the other hand, what can we do to fill the gaps that emerge in regional economies? On the first, I think really active asset stewardship that's really specific is important. So, you know, what are the numbers? How many workers are being helped? How many of them are finding new jobs? How many hours of career support have they got? What does your training budget look like? All of those kind of things, they're the questions to ask. And I think we've definitely seen some positive movement in terms of investors being much clearer and more direct and specific, and that's certainly helping. We're seeing some of the fruits of that in terms of when we rock up and talk to an asset, or talk to a company, and the type of things that we're saying that were probably foreign to them a few years ago about what should be done with the workforce, they now understand it, and part of that is because they've heard it from some of the investors. The other thing which I think is much harder, and I think needs to be the sort of next frontier, and Ros has spoken about it. So at the end of the day, there are going to be pressures and expectations around divestment, and also you know, other pressures around wanting companies to take action. And I think that implies a responsibility around the S part of ESG, particularly for regions that are really highly dependent on these industries. And so I think what that means is, how are we thinking about capital allocation, or how are you guys thinking about capital allocation into regions? And it's not just what are the big shiny things that might be in the renewables transition, but what are the other things that are going on in the region that create other types of job opportunities? And I know that presents a whole bunch of practical scale and hurdle rate issues, and not having visibility of what those opportunities are, but I think that needs to be the next part of the conversation. And I think a good place to start is being more active in the regions. And at the end of the day, I think we need to get to the point of going, okay, what's the role of government in trying to make this a bit easier for investors to do the right thing in those regions? Like, as a resident of the Hunter, you know, it's silly for us just to look at institutional investors as people carrying a briefcase full of cash that they might turn up and spend on stuff that will create jobs for us. Like, that's not real. But at the same time, I think regional actors and super funds together, I think, can do something really significant, which says, okay, there's a real imperative for these places here. Yes, the government has to lead it, but these are the type of things we want government to do that will allow investors to look at these regions in a way that they may not otherwise.
As a government as a means to sort of unlock investment opportunities. That's interesting. Part of the discussion this morning, and again, sort of Minister hinted towards the sort of just transition aspect, or the concept of a just transition authority. I mean, starting with you, Ros, and maybe moving across, thoughts on the just transition, the establishment of a just transition authority, and how it could sort of help you with these issues?
Yeah, look, picking up on a lot of the themes that you've just spoken about, Warwick, and adding to that, there is a real risk of fragmentation, in particular between, you know, federal and state government policies, and there's a real risk of lack of sequencing. And I think that sequencing will help address some of the issues that, you know, you're facing and then the Hunter is facing. And so I think, given you know, if we were able to have like a central authority, I think it would be able to absolutely help with coordination and planning, because I think that's absolutely critical. And so, look, we've been a really strong advocate for a just transition authority. So I think any remarks I say, I'll probably keep coming back to, you know, the need for this sequencing, planning, coordination. And I think it'll help identify those pockets of workers, those pockets of businesses. It'll go to one of the points that Jim raised, you know, about the potential to aggregate as well, and, you know, come up with new investment vehicles and so forth. So it'll help with, I think, all of those things. I mean, it's not a panacea, but it will certainly help.
What do you think, Travis, from a company perspective?
Look, the logic of it's compelling. The detail needs to be played out, but I guess I just want to pick up two parts to it. One is the coordination element, and think of that in two ways. So one is the coordination across, facilities or circumstances, but the other is how do you coordinate the best for the opportunities? Like that, and I think that is the hardest to unlock and the biggest potential here as well for making the transition more about making the best of an opportunity rather than minimising the downside. And it'll be really interesting to see how that rhythm changes throughout regions over time based on circumstances and what opportunities reveal themselves over time. So that coordination is critical. The second part is to try and if you don't mind me saying, but support organisations like ours to understand, to try and get some similarity and context and consistency around how you approach it, and some support to enable the best outcome for workers. At the minute, I started off by saying that each closure, each transition is its own set of unique circumstances. I suspect that will always be true, but you can mitigate the extent to which it's true by providing some greater structure around it, rather than, can I say, the goodwill of the organisation and the strength of the community and the length of time in the region or whatever the other factors are.
No, that's useful and all too sensible. I guess on the opportunity side, again, an often used term, opportunities. What do you think those look like, or what would be an example?
Oh, look, and so this is my day job. So I'm not the policy just transition person at AGL. My day job is bring that forward. The renewables boom is here and on, and that will be in place for the next couple of decades. And so, I don't want to say we should take that for granted, but you can see the train has already left the station on that one, and there's all sorts of challenges in enabling it and the time frame we want to do it on. But what is going to happen there is pretty clear. The opportunity side of things is where I suspect the Australian economy will do what we've always done, which is identify a small number of highly successful industries and transition those in a decarbonised world to be global leaders. The history of the Australian economy, I think, sort of reveals that. Not always with the decarbonised angle, but that's the theme of the coming couple of decades. And so that is where the opportunities. That's where the opportunities are. The idea that we could become, a renewables advantaged country, and the fact that we can have enough renewables to supply our grid, and there are other regions in the world that just don't have that same renewable resource. So there's got to be some form of transition fuel. The most likely answer for that today is hydrogen / ammonia, and so the role we can play as a location that can receive investment globally, is a safe place to invest, has a highly skilled workforce, but it's around targeted industries. And so yes, AGL is absolutely doing some feasibility studies across all of our sites around the opportunity for future industries. Things like hydrogen are a good example of that, but also decarbonisation of other hard to abate sectors. This is the hardest piece of the next decade. It's the bit with the most opportunity.
No, that's really useful. And Warwick, moving to you. Again, just transition authority, good idea, bad idea, and then what does it need to do, most importantly?
Yeah, look, excellent idea. At the end of the day, someone needs to be responsible. I had a really interesting experience. It was about 6 or 7 years ago when we were trying to stimulate a conversation about this in the Hunter, and we had a sort of Chatham House Rules conversation that had a bunch of people from industry, from government. I think some of Travis's colleagues were there at the time. And we got these guys over from Holland who were excellent transition management experts, and they were trying to sort of progress us through. And they asked a question. You could see they were getting a bit frustrated. They were Dutch, and they might as well says a lot, but they might as well have been speaking Dutch, I think, for some of the folks. And essentially, you could see them getting frustrated, and they said, "All right, so something closes. who's responsible for supporting the workers? And so, everyone's conferring with each other, and someone from one of the employers put their hands up and said, it's everyone's responsibility. And they went, well, that means it's nobody's, right? And so I think with something like this, you need an authority that's going to be responsible. I think that's the start. The second most important thing is you need to develop that expertise about what we are actually going to do to deal with this. And I think this is where we take lessons from elsewhere, but we put them in an Australian context. So I think underlying, I think the ideas and the specific interventions from Europe are really helpful, but I think there is this it's like a sort of Keynesian conceit around just transition that, we're going to do all these things to, chase new industries and all of this type of thing. But we have a different political economy in this country as well. And so I think we need to think about what are the things that we can translate. But at the end of the day, authority is really important. We've got hopefully something coming out, in the budget next week. We've got a new state government in this state who's committed to regional authorities, starting with one in the Hunter. So that gives us a good opportunity, but they need to be well set up, well funded, and they need to hit the ground running and do things. Otherwise, people will get frustrated quickly.
Yep, no, definitely bring it back to the doing, not the talking.
Yep.
Just a question from the audience, Ros, and again, demonstrating again the link between different ESG issues. How do you balance the transition to renewables with the human rights challenges in the supply chain, such as risks of forced labour, raw materials, mineral extraction, processing, etc.? So thinking about that in a just transition context.
Yeah, just the easy questions.
That's it.
Thanks. Look, I think we can't solve for everything all at once. I think that if we're doing DD on a new investment, of course, we're able to factor in all those things and should be factoring those things. We should be, appointing relevant, environmental consultants to assist with, the environmental components. We should be aware of who either our investments or investment managers' assets are using down their supply chain. How much confidence do we have in it? How much opportunity do we have to influence any outcomes depending on where, the components are coming from? Generally speaking, some of our own direct investments, we've got a lot of confidence in who those or where those componentry parts come from, and in terms of those supply chain companies' approach to human rights and so forth. But as you know yourself, it is really hard, particularly where you've got a large proportion of your investments managed by external managers. You've got really broad, long supply chains to actually identify some of these risks. So there's still, part of the job is doing your DD. Part of our job is also supporting the development of access to data, access to information, so that we can actually address and identify some of these risks. So there's lots of moving parts and lots of things to think about.
Sorry, can I just add? Okay. There's another example of opportunity. Now, it won't solve the entire problem, but the focus of onshoring, when you know what your pipeline of work is another example where you can begin to manage those risks. And that is a theme that has evolved over the past few years for a whole range of reasons, but there's another example of opportunity.
And I guess to Jim's challenge of going to good jobs or comparable jobs or retraining, if the jobs in the renewable industry don't sort of stack up or don't provide that role, clearly communities aren't really going to come along for that ride. Is that something that AGL would think about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a real risk, and I think it was well described in terms of the circumstance in the Hunter and perhaps coal export over the past 2 decades, which has changed what it was like 3 decades ago, 4 decades ago. And so trying to find parity or something near parity is an incredible challenge.
I guess we've talked a lot about the barriers to the just transition. I guess some more discussion of the thoughts. Again, we've talked about Just Transition Authority, but I was wondering, perhaps if I start with you, Ros, about some of the opportunities or some of that doing you think can happen in the short term, whether it be, at the company level, government level or sort of industry level?
Yeah, look, I think as I said before, the Just Transition Authority is not a panacea. There is a lot of other moving parts that we need to solve for here and need government to be active on. So I think things like border policy and disclosure settings are absolutely important in this space so that we have consistent and credible decarbonisation plans. We can then remain invested and continue to support companies, also their workforces, communities and First Peoples, and also I think address those concerns that are raised by those calling for divestment. That helps with that. I think the other opportunity I think for government is to develop sector pathways, and again that will help with sequencing.
Yeah, no, definitely. And for you, Travis?
Oh, look, I mean, I don't want to underplay just how enormously difficult this transition is. What we're undertaking here is incredible in its scale and nature. But I do want to highlight the green shoot of collaboration and cooperation that's happening between industries, with employees, within communities, and with government. Now, it requires far greater coordination than exists today, but the intent, the leaning into it is very real. And of course, we see it because we've announced closure and we've lived through it. It's not, the workforce. It's not a confrontational discussion that's being had. It's one of collaboration. How can we move forward? As long as the workforce can see that you are genuine in what you're trying to do and you're doing the things that are required, and maybe it was easier because of the unique circumstances we had, but you can also see governments looking to support, and when we're looking for other industry partners to invest at our locations that we are transitioning, you are seeing that genuine interest. And it's because of these overarching themes of climate change, of renewable energy, of onshoring, that there's a moment in time where you can see that there's a grasping of the net around what's required. It's how do we make that real? We're at the very start of it. How do you make that real over the next decade?
I completely agree, if you don't mind, Ed. I think this is a fabulous opportunity for investors, government, companies and other stakeholders to join together, to band together. But what that's going to take is a lot of mutual trust, yes, and I think agreed alignment or common goals. So I think really we're probably not wrapping up, but one of the points I did want to make at the end was that need for mutual trust and an alignment of goals is going to be critical. And I actually am thoroughly enjoying the opportunity to work across sectors. I think that cross-sectoral leadership will be successful ultimately. We have to be.
Yeah, no choice.
No. And Warren?
Yeah, look, I think Travis's point is really well made about the moment that we're in. I think it would be a mistake to think that now we've embarked on this transition journey and now we're talking about it, to think that means it's going to be a linear path. It's not. It's absolutely going to be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or potentially 2 steps forward, 20 steps back at some stage. This is going to get hard, and I think there's a real imperative at the moment where we have a moment where challenges about this change are becoming obvious, but they're not acute. And so it's a really important time for setting the foundations about what we're going to do. And so, I think if that's the investment community, it's very much, okay, what are the things that we might be doing that help set up that foundation that wouldn't necessarily be things we would usually do? Because I think there's a broader interest there. At the end of the day, if you care about communities in these type of places and these type of communities and the opportunities there, then there's a clear imperative to work out how to do it. Even for those that don't, the underlying reality is that if these communities are upset, then they know a lot about spanners and they will know exactly where to stick them, which will stop the pace of the transition. That's absolutely real. Like Adani Convoy is an example, right? So we've all been there before, but we've got this moment where if everyone can concentrate on this and land a couple of the specific outcomes, engaging with communities, understanding where to invest, getting the institutional pieces in, then they will work and they'll become durable for when we really, really need them.
Thanks, Warwick. And if any spanner advice, you can see Warwick after the session or more background. We are at time, or very close to time. I just wanted to finish because, again, we've talked a lot about complex issues. We've talked about sort of very long-term issues. Bringing it back to the here and now, you know, from each panellist, I think, what's one thing you'd like to see happen in the next sort of 12 months to really make the just transition a reality in Australia? So, Ros.
Yeah, I think I'll repeat a couple of things that I've said. I think we do need policy settings. We need disclosure settings. We need to be able to remain invested. We need to be able to retain conviction. We need to be able to see where the opportunities are. We need to be able to see which companies, which sectors are transitioning. So, policy settings.
Travis?
For me, it's really clear because it's very real for me at the minute. There's got to be greater effort towards that collaboration. Yep, that's the key.
Warwick?
I would say for investors, get out and understand the dynamics and the investment opportunities in the regions, and then own the process of going to government and saying, this is what we need to make it possible for us to help these places.
Fantastic note to finish on. So join me in thanking our panel.